Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I had the privilege of reviewing a debut novel by an indie author, which is something I'm always very keen to do. And in this case, it was To Castle Kingside by John W. Grundy. Now, full disclaimer, the author did reach out to me and actually sent me this book for free, so no money exchanged hands in this, which means that I get to say whatever I want about this book. This is a totally honest review still, and I will attempt to be as unbiased as possible. That being said, first and foremost, I've mentioned this many times on the channel, as much as I humanly can, I love to review indie books. I love the idea of folks sort of striking out on their own and publishing something that, in the case of this book especially, coming in at over 300,000 words, is probably not one that a traditional publisher would have picked up. And it's a shame, because when people are given the opportunity to do cool, unique, and creative things, we get books like this, which are super cool. Again, so big thanks to John for sending this over my way. And also, like, as indies go, like, this is like a really nice book. I've reviewed a couple books recently that are just like really physically well put together, like the cover, like the dust jacket on this, and I'll show some footage so you guys can see it. It's like really nice. So shout outs to the Paper Jam, I guess, the company that put this together. All that being said, what is this novel? If you look there on the cover, it is a high-tech novel. What is high-tech? What is this book? Now, when John first reached out to me, sort of gave me the overview of this book, he said that it had done quite well in lit RPG circles. Now, lit RPG is a genre that this year, I'm going to dive into it. I'm going to figure out what it's all about. I worked in the video game industry for many years. It's something that I'm intimately familiar with, but it's not something that I have particularly explored. And while this book did do quite well in that scene, by no means would I actually call this a lit RPG. I don't think it has a lot of the progression fantasy. I don't think it has a lot of the sort of quintessential hallmarks like the leveling up every chapter and the physical, tangible stats. That being said, and I mean this in the most loving way possible, this is definitely a book for nerds, especially for those of us who grew up reading a lot of the really classic and vintage sci-fi. If you're someone like me who did that, this book will feel right at home. Now, let's dive into it. Now, the front of this book has like an interesting sort of premise and it's not even a prologue, I guess a foreword. And normally I'm not a huge fan of this kind of thing, like setting up the world building, but I make an exception for this book because this is really what hooked me on it. This book is, for lack of a better term, based on a true story, or stories, I guess, because this book is the collection of stories of a group of friends who I guess started in high school and university playing tabletop RPG games. I guess started with systems like D&D and eventually ended up making their own, what they called Hitec, this really deep, rich lore science fiction universe. And this is a collection of the stories from the players in that game. And that's so freaking cool. I've played many hours of mostly Pathfinder actually, but Dungeons and Dragons adjacent games. And I think all of us at some point have sitting around the table have dreamed, like, what happens if I actually sat down and like wrote a book about this? Because these stories are amazing and some of the character interactions are fantastic. And you have moments that never would happen any other way. And that was really the hook that drew me into this. Not necessarily so much about the plot of what was happening, but the idea that, again, this was, obviously embellished and it's a story at the end of the day, but it was real. And the collection of stories from friends, I guess over like 15 years, put together into this book. And as a sort of a general premise goes, that's pretty darn cool. But let's talk about the story itself. So the book follows a group of mercenaries called Parliament, and they essentially live, within the law, like vaguely sanctioned by the coalition government, coalition being these collections of planets, humans, and a bunch of other alien species in this sort of near-Earth human future. It's FTL level technology, I'll be honest, is a little bit all over the place. In this story, there tends to be some MacGuffin-y type tech that ends up coming into play over the course of the book, but technology is like a very standard, like kind of side. They've got bullets and rockets, but also lasers, and they can shoot like heavy ions at people. So yeah, kind of, I guess, in the Star Wars, Star Trek realm in terms of overall tech level. The story follows this group as they're sort of called in for one last job. At this point, when we meet our sort of intrepid heroes, they're more like on the grizzled veteran end of the scale. They've lost members along the way. And at this point, they've all kind of drifted a little bit, sort of doing their own thing. But their leader, Bullseye, yeah, they've got silly names. Be prepared for that. sort of brings the crew together again, sort of for this one last job. And he's, a character that's, I mean, a lot of them have, but dealing with a lot of trauma. And he's kind of low key thinking maybe I'll go to Valhalla on this one. Though he is a Seti, which is like an anthropomorphic cat person. So maybe not Valhalla so much, but you get the idea. Maybe thinking this might be the one where he goes out because he's dealing with some demons. Let's put it that way. Long and short of it, the job does not go according to plan. And one of their crew gets kidnapped. And they feel like, wait a second, I need to figure out what the heck is going on with this. And as they continue to pull on that thread, as they sort of try and unravel the mystery behind what exactly is going on, they realize that they are at the ire of someone from their past and embroiled in literally an intergalactic conspiracy that has ramifications across, all of settled space, essentially. And it follows them on this very epic and winding journey to sort of get to the bottom of it, and in some cases get a little bit of revenge. Now, this book follows quite a few different POVs, basically follows every POV of the main cast, of the sort of the five main crew, as well as a smattering of other POVs thrown in. And I'll be honest, I'm generally not a fan of these like massive POV spanning novels. Obviously, there are a couple exceptions to this. But in general, I tend to prefer novels that are a little bit tighter when it comes to POVs, a few less characters to pick from, and let you spend more time in the minds of those characters to really get to know them. Now, all that being said, just due to the sheer length of this book, again, it's 600 pages, but these are dense pages. That doesn't really end up being a big issue overall. I mean, Grundy does a really good job of sort of making each character feel distinct, which I do appreciate, given the fact that they share so much common history, but because of like the different races and how they're interconnected and there are different backgrounds and cultures, everyone does definitely have their own really unique feel and personality. That being said, coming back to good old Bullseye, he speaks, I don't know if this was a choice the player character made, like all those years. I imagine it must have been. I don't know why he would have carried this over otherwise, but he speaks like a Shakespearean, like thespian. He has this like very over the top speech, which I will be honest, did get kind of tiring after so many pages, but I digress. That being said, he also had sort of a few one-off POVs a little bit, including going into the minds of some of the villains, which I'm personally a little bit less of a fan of. I much prefer to sort of get more of their story, whether they're finding out through espionage or uncovering records or files or what have you in this kind of military sci-fi context. But in this case, due to the nature of the main villain, the main antagonist, finding out more about their backstory, I do actually think added quite a bit here. So I sort of bet my rule on this one, only having a couple chapters with this character, but still going like, okay, like I appreciate why you're showing me this, and it does help give a good amount of context. All that being said, this book, like I said, follows a pretty, I would say, winding and meandering plot. If you go in knowing, like I said, what you know at the start of this idea that this is based on like the real adventures of this group, it's harder to judge, honestly, the plot overall, because I think normally if you were to look at this as like a very straight sci-fi book, it's a little bit plotting. Like there's a little bit of the real fetch quest element. Okay, you've got to go here and you talk to this person, you find this out, and you've got to go like this other person, and then you're calling the contacts, and they like, okay, now we're in the underground, and we're like, dealing with, gotta get a disguise and get this character, and then you got to go to talk to this other. It's just like there was a little bit of sort of that element to it. Which is, again, a little bit more bogged down by the fact that you sort of had the party sort of split, and you had these sort of two main stories kind of going on side by side, and you'd be splitting between POVs of characters that are physically together, which is cool to get, again, the different POVs, but at the same time, again, maybe felt a little bit redundant for me in some cases and did sort of slow down the overall pacing. Now, again, it's not that a lot didn't happen in this book. It's not that there weren't moments where things moved quickly, but overall, I would say, like, you're sitting down to commit some time to reading this book. And when I say dense, this book is pretty dense. One of the things that really stuck out to me, and again, in some cases, a really beautiful way, was actually, the prose, the descriptions. Often you'd start a chapter and you'd be on this new planet or looking over the city or this scene or whatever. And, I'll read an excerpt from it here, really nice prose. But when you have this at the sort of like every single chapter, it was sometimes a little bit much. And again, I'll give you an example here. The cloudless sky high above the charcoal dunes of Noel Khan left not a wisp to reflect the fading fire of the setting suns. leaving the 3 rising moons instead to whitewash the heavens in the lustrous radiance of their soft pearly glow. The effect was a sky that was bright yet free of color, a pale milky dome above the black desert vast. Boat looked around, disconcerted for even the slightest hint of pigment, a blade of grass, an airborne raptor, or the purple haze of distant mountains. But there was nothing, only the blackened sands and dark pillars of volcanic glass below, the gauzy white above, and whispers of gray that ran between at the horizon. A perfectly monotone landscape. Bassetti mused to himself that it was like traversing an old Ansel Adams snapshot. So yeah, like you totally get this beautiful, stunning image of this, but again, when you start like almost every single chapter in some way, shape, or form like this, it honestly kind of reminded me a little bit of George R. R. Martin's prose style when it comes to these like really weighty, in like not leaving anything to the imagination, like you're really trying to feel like you're there and really trying to paint a picture, which again, I do appreciate. It's just sort of maybe not done quite so elegantly. And in some cases I was like, okay, like I get it, but I kind of want to get back to the action a little bit here. And again, there was one more egregious example or a couple of egregious examples, but this one was so interesting. I mean, you'd walk into like a hangar bay on a ship and there'd be all these different shuttles, but they're not just shuttles. Every single one of these shuttles has backstory and history, and equipped with, you learn every single gun and laser and turret and like shield generator and what their capability is at speed, and like, yeah, they have cloaking, and it's not just like they have a turret, but it's not like an AE-500 turret, blaster or whatever. And it's like every single gun is labeled and every single piece of tech. And again, if you're someone who's into that, like I imagine it could be super cool, but I think for me, I'm like, I know that it's just there as part of the set dressing. So it's a little bit hard. Like, I know I don't need to memorize this piece of information. I know like the name of this pistol isn't going to be probably a relevant plot point later. And this, I think, was where I think this book had again, this is where the quirks arose, because as much as I think he was writing it for himself, as much as I think he was writing it for us, the audience, I think really he was writing this book for his friends, so that they could all sort of go back and enjoy and relive these moments together. So I felt like probably over the course of these pages, there were 1,000 Easter eggs that I likely missed. That's literally just for this small group of people who are intimately familiar with this setting. And that's so cool. It is super neat, but it also just means that sometimes I feel like I'm missing out a little bit, which is fine, but it's just sort of like, man, I'd be curious, not again, there's no way you humanly could, but having some of that context, it was kind of interesting. I think, again, I sort of touched on it earlier. If you're someone who grew up reading a lot of like classic sci-fi from maybe like the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, especially on the military sci-fi side of things, this book would probably be right at home for a lot of folks. And I think for better or for worse, though, maybe just sort of based on the stylization of the time, maybe just sort of the nature of the group of players that was playing, this is a dude book. And this is a dude book. There's like, big manly men with explosives and guns, and they're rappelling in and they're blowing shit up. And every single woman character in the books is this, ridiculous over the top beauty. And, there really aren't any female POV characters in this at all. And the ones that are, it's like 1 or 2 chapters. And very often the women in this book were just like trophies to be won, essentially. So I think sort of looking at it through more of that modern lens, maybe, and again, it was parts of it were definitely a little bit tongue in cheek. Like there was definitely some self-awareness there going into this, but doesn't change the fact that like, the only real women, sure, they're like badass mercenaries often in their own right, but are still just like kind of reduced down to being motivation for the male characters. Didn't really have any of their own, basically really have any of their own autonomy in the story at all. So again, this is a little bit on rails because again, you're reliving some of this, but I would say if I had that's probably my single largest gripe with the entire book. I wish we could have gotten, especially one of the characters we meet later on, seems like she had a really interesting background and sort of being raised in this mercenary world. Would have been really interesting to, I think, see more sort of through her lens. Now, again, if you're someone who grew up as a fan of tabletop RPGs, if you're someone who's played D&D, if you're someone who grew up on classic sci-fi, I would recommend checking. And you're in for a 600-page monster of a book. I would recommend checking this one out. I think there is a lot of really cool things that are sort of explored here. And it's going to feel, as much as none of us have ever played Hitec, the game, it's still going to feel familiar because it takes a lot of the really well-worn tropes that we know from a lot of other pieces of literature. I mean, again, it reminds me of like a strange combination of like a Game of Thrones meets Altered Carbon meets, I don't know, like nods to Star Trek and Star Wars, like I mentioned before. And yeah, I don't know. I enjoyed this book. Again, I definitely think it had its flaws. Like I think you could have gone at this thing with a hacksaw if you were really just trying to make a more tighter, leaner sci-fi book. You probably could have cut, I don't know, 100,000 words out of this thing and just really streamline the process. But the fact that it wasn't, at the end of the day, more than anything, this book just felt like a labor of love. Like this book would have been, I mean, this book was decades in the making, the world building, decades in the making to get to this point. And that's really cool. And that's really unique. And I definitely enjoyed that. And you could feel the love sort of on every page. And I really did enjoy that. So yeah, again, I think this is definitely not a book for everybody. Like again, if you're someone who's maybe only read more modern sci-fi and you're used to stuff that's a lot trimmer and you're sort of used to more, more recent genre conventions, this might not be quite for you. But if you're someone who's looking for just a fast-paced, blow 'em up romp with some interesting discussions about philosophy and politics and a really interesting megalomaniac villain, then yeah, I would recommend checking this one out. And again, I'm always a proponent of trying to profile indie authors when I can here on the channel. So once again, thanks to John for sending this over. And I'm, this is, it doesn't say anywhere, but judging by how the book ended, I will guess this is the first in a series. So I'm curious to see how the rest of the books end up going in this one and if they're all going to be as chonky as this one. So anyway, that was To Castle Kingside. You can get it on Amazon and stuff if you guys want to go check it out. Yeah, I'm going to be reading a bunch more different books, so be prepared for kind of an all over the place upcoming month on the channel. I had a lot of folks clamoring for me to read the next book in the Red Rising series, so that will also be happening, and I will give thoughts on that because people had thoughts on my thoughts, so that was fun indeed. Again, if you like the video and you want to see more content like this from all manners of sci-fi and fantasy, a lot of fantasy coming down the pipe as well, be sure to hit that subscribe button and like if you enjoyed it. And thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.